Welcome back to Ethics of Negotiation, Conflict Resolution, and Peace Building. Today I want to focus on an ethical requirement that only concerns mediation: appropriateness. And you know, here's a tip I give my students who don't have the time or just don't like reading all that much and maybe skim through the assigned reading, rely on their classmates to learn the concepts and what we're focusing on the course. You can always go to the index of, this is Negotiation Alchemy, or the index of Holding These Truths, and look up every topic in the course description and every topic that we cover week by week. Appropriateness has several different pages where it's addressed. So does cultural competence, power balancing, both books. So that's a quick and easy way to get the baseline understanding of what we're focusing on in this course. Let me turn to a page in Holding These Truths that talks about appropriateness. I'm turning to page 176, and I will be reading some of what it says. Actually, I'm going to read from the code of ethics that are underneath the proposed third-party conflict intervener competencies on page 176. Now, before I focus on appropriateness, as I look at the Code of Ethics language, the Academy for Family Mediators has a wonderful quote that relates to cultural competence. And I know I did not quote from the books regarding cultural competence language, but let me do it here. Discloses any biases or strong views relating to the issues to be mediated. So you have an ethical requirement as a mediator if you are following the Academy of Family Mediation Code of Ethics to disclose any biases you have about the issues to be mediated. Now, I would interpret that broadly. If I had a cross-cultural mediation, and let's say I had, which I've had, a Brazilian wife and her Brazilian daughter's married to an American man, and I have strong bias in favor of Brazilian values regarding family, and against, and this was, I have many white men in my family who I love and adore, but this was a white American man, and I tend to have a bias that traditional white American men are not as devoted to their family. Now, when I was asked to mediate a conflict regarding their marriage relationship, I would have an ethical obligation to disclose that, even though they were not mediating their devotion to family. They were mediating the relationship expectations regarding how the stepfather related to the mother in her relationships with her daughter. So I interpret these quite broadly. But let me now go back to appropriateness, because that is the focus for today. And let me read from the next Code of Ethics, which is from Colorado. It says, gathers requisite background information to adequately and effectively diagnose and structure appropriateness of proceeding with mediation. And it refers to history of violence involving the parties. It also refers to party capacity. Now, party capacity has been addressed when talking about party self-determination, the fundamental underlying principle of mediation. Appropriateness relates in that if a party lacks capacity, if they are mentally handicapped, disabled, emotionally ill, without, the counseling, the psychology they need to self-determine. If they are young, and usually, younger than 12 is definitely a child who lacks party capacity to be in a mediation. Over 12 is discussed by courts, lawyers, and mediators around the country. I'm not sure what the world is saying about this particular issue. But anyone who lacks party capacity in a mediation can make that process inappropriate unless you find ways to empower that party and help them obtain the capacity to self-determine. And in the reading you see you can do that through asking if the party has educated themselves legally about their legal rights, asking if they've consulted with a lawyer. And at this point I'll say lawyers are often involved in U.S. mediations, especially divorce and custody parenting mediations. I have worked with many mediation-friendly lawyers. In fact, my full-time mediation practice, I received most of my referrals from lawyers. So if some of you are thinking that mediation is the way to avoid the legal system, it's not that simple. In fact, you might be doing something unethical if you don't embrace and open to involving the law, lawyers, and the legal system in your mediation. Now, I have taught advanced mediation to those of you who are really interested in being mediators, or those of you who have been actively mediating for a while. And I'm working with our current director to see if we might, figure out a way to add that to the curriculum as our curriculum advances. If not, and in the interim, some of you actually, after you graduate with your master's, will consider our postgraduate certificate program as a way of receiving intensive internship practicum work in mediation and getting, more of this information working with me or other faculty in independent studies, doing a creative project thesis. There are options that you might want to pursue. Generally, mediation is inappropriate if there has been a history of violence, there is a present risk of violence, or there is a serious risk of future violence. Because that kind of bullying, coercion, you can imagine the dynamic, makes mediation inappropriate. So mediators out there who are mediating domestic abuse, for example, are highly controversial. It is hard to empower an abused spouse to self-determine and balance power with an abuser who has not yet acknowledged their abuse, the harm they are doing. And usually with most domestic abusers, that takes prosecution and a cracking open of major denial systems. It's just not possible to do what we need to do ethically in our field with that violence or risk of violence present. So generally, if you learn when you're doing your screening, your first meeting of parties, that there has been past violence, and that might include child abuse, depending on what you're mediating, juvenile abuse. You will need, as a mediator, to let the parties know that ethically you're not able to help them unless, there might be a case where you have counselors and attorneys at the mediation tables ensuring, that it's a power-balanced process and that it's appropriate. I have done related work, but then I have a history Before I became a lawyer and a mediator, I was studying social work and received my bachelor's in nonprofit administration. I have actually done some family therapy work in my past and have, as you're reading in both books, worked with juvenile treatment as the head of treatment. Very successful use of mediation with treatment. So I'm one of a rare kind of social work mediator, psychologist mediator, lawyer mediator group that's prepared to notice the signs and assess what's appropriate. Most mediators are not, and they will need to withdraw from the process. I think that's pretty clear cut. Of course, if you see some of the other things happening that we've discussed in that I've discussed in other lectures, like bad faith, lying, deceit, that's going to make the process inappropriate as well, and you'll need to withdraw. If parties are not committed to respecting you or the ground rules you've negotiated in a good faith way, that will also make the process inappropriate. So I'm giving you some of the basics around appropriateness of mediation. As always, you're welcome to write me with questions and concerns, and I will be, discussing this more with you in postings throughout the course. Enough said for today. Have a great week.